Mickelsen's book. I just picked it up. By the way, I encourage you, do not leave a stack of books back there on that table. These people who bring them expect, that's how they're going to pay for the ticket back home, and don't make them carry their books back with them, especially Dr. Weisner's. He's really, really, really wonderful. I call them smart books. I get calls almost every week from somebody who will say, hey, would you put a reading list up on your website or something so we know what you're reading? And I got a handful of smart books that I keep always close to me where I want to do research. Dr. Weisner's is prominent there. Michael Ferris's book on From Tyndale to Madison is a magnificent book. I'll be adding Chelsen's book to my list of smart books. Except you quoted Calvin Coolidge in your book. So if you don't say anything, you can't be called on to repeat it. I don't exactly know how to proceed from that point. Am I allowed to talk? That's funny. That's good stuff. Let me just get started. Once upon a time, in the year 1621, the Pilgrim colony was in trouble. They were starving to death, a famine caused by communism. Not the last famine caused by communism, but probably the most famous. Nearly half of the 102 passengers on the Mayflower were going to starve to death and die in the cold in the winter, especially after a fire had destroyed their common storehouse and their meager supplies. Plus another ship had just arrived, dropped off about 36 more people that they were supposed to feed and get started, and the Governor Bradford, had to put everybody on half rations. Almost everybody remembers that first Thanksgiving of the Pilgrims, but fewer people know why the colony almost failed in the first place. It's the disaster of common ownership. All of their supplies were rationed according to need. The tools were rationed according to need. The animals, the work, the crops, and the profits were all held in common and divided up according to need. But what's lesser known about that, the Pilgrims didn't organize themselves that way. That was not something they would have chosen for themselves. They were religious and political zealots, pretty much like you people. And they had the ridiculous notion that serving God and worshiping God according to their understanding was more important than their creature comforts back at home. So rather than conforming to the state religions in the old country, they wanted to go to a place where they could have religious freedom, so they packed up and got ready to sail. Unfortunately, the Pilgrims were broke. They didn't have much money, and they didn't have the passage, they didn't have the fare enough to pay their way to the New World, so they went out, they hired an agent, and that agent went out there and found them some money. They found some investors. They were called economic adventurers back then. That's how the investors were called. We would call them high-risk investment bankers today. But those bankers, those high-risk investors, gave the Pilgrims some money to pay their way. The problem was the Pilgrims were not told about the arrangements. The people who funded them said, we wanted to have everything in common. Everybody's just going to share everything. They're going to share the tools, they're going to share the profits, and they're going to pay us out of that shared accumulation. And the Pilgrims, as they were boarding, were told of these arrangements. By that time, the agent was pretty smart. He got his commission. And everybody got on the bus to the New World. And they weren't told about the fine print until they were on their way and it was too late to back out. Well, here's how Governor Bradford described how the colonists responded to this share the wealth, share the work equally arrangement. I have to modernize the language a little bit. Sharing the work and its results confused and irritated everybody. The young men resented that they got paid the same as the old guys who did less work. Hard work wasn't rewarded, and those who lacked the ability or efficiency got paid the same and fed as the people who were working hard and were competent. Plus, the women hated cooking for people other than their own husbands and families, and really hated washing the underwear of other women's husbands. And they thought it little better than slavery. So they did as all slaves do. They became slackers. We here in Iowa would call this Iowa passive aggressive. When we're on the road, somebody honks at us, we don't speed up, we slow down. That's what slaves do. And that character trait in all of us almost killed the Pilgrims, because nobody wanted to work. And when they wouldn't be rewarded for their hard work, they just didn't work that hard. And they nearly starved to death. But in 1623, they successfully petitioned the money guys, the investors, to give them some economic freedom so they could work on their own plots of land. Long story short, the settlement had an explosion of productivity and prosperity, enough for them to have a real Thanksgiving later, and this time they really meant it. By the way, it took them 15 years to pay off that debt to those investors. A couple of times they had to extend the loans, and they ended up paying between 30 to 50% in interest. It wouldn't surprise me to learn that those usurious money men eventually became Chase Manhattan, but I usually spit on the ground when I say Chase Manhattan. Sorry. Today I'm almost polite. To paraphrase Governor Bradford, the experiment which some of the finest men tried and failed makes me think of similar notions of compelled common ownership. First thought of by Plato, and more recently by some contemporary thinkers, that socialism, that is a community of goods or a commonwealth of goods, can work and make people happy as if they were wiser than God. Just a couple of decades later, the prospering New England Puritans had expanded their settlements out of Massachusetts and into the rest of what we call the old New England. And they continued to experiment with property ownership versus private property. First, they wanted to protect the continuity of their spirituality. They wanted to preserve their Puritan communities. And they tried to invite only like-minded and spiritually similar people to come and join in their communities, and that was really, really hard to enforce. So, almost impossible. So they decided the best way to keep that community conformity going was to, how would they do that? Oh, if you can't make the people believe the same, well, at least we can make them sort of do business in a common way. So that they decided the best way to do that, to maintain community cohesion, was to insist that the community share common grazing rights for the animals and share common land to grow crops. The commoners, those who had legal access to the common fields and the meadows, were too often in what we would now call today as free riding. They were worried at free riders. People didn't work as hard as everybody else. That annoyed them as much as it did in these New England communities. It did back in the original colonies. They didn't want any shiftless people intruding on their good nature. So they planted crops in the common property, but some of the people neglected to keep their portion of the commons properly fenced. It was impossible to keep track of who was responsible for what in these commons, so the towns began to assign monitors. And workers, okay, you're supposed to be there, you're supposed to be over there, your animal's supposed to be here, your crops are supposed to be here, here's where your little area in the common is supposed to be, and we're going to have somebody monitor everybody's behavior. But animals were wandering around, poorly maintained fences, and the towns invited these newfound monitors, first bureaucrats, the very first political thing they did, introducing politics into common ownership. And that's the first step, try to make people virtuous. You need a bureaucrat. And so the towns hired community fence inspectors, and then community livestock monitors, And all to no avail, and tensions grew and grew. They even had a special general court that kept track of all these things. And I'm going to cut this short, but for the first 50 years of the New England experiment, the official historians of that era noted that the Puritans were really, truly obsessed. These were really intense people. Not just with spirituality or godliness or with sex or theology, but according to court records, the bulk of the legislation under discussion for the first 50 years of the existence of their colony settlements revolved around two endless problems that were almost always bothersome to the Puritans. Pigs, without rings in their noses, running around town, and midnight tree cutters. Midnight tree cutters? Wood rustlers. Taking somebody else's wood from somebody else's property and cutting down and using it for heating or whatever. So those were the two legal issues that vexed the Puritans the most in the first half century of their existence. Treat pigs without rings in their nose, who insisted on sticking their noses into other people's property, literally, and then consuming it. So the constant turmoil lasted about a half century, and finally the Puritans just sort of gave up on common ownership. Let everybody do their own thing on their own property, and be economically free, as they are now have been spiritually free. And of course, they were right to be worried about social cohesion, but common ownership of anything never works. And this is what later has been called the tragedy of the commons. Why is there a tragedy associated with common ownership of anything? Well, here it was observed, here's the code I want you to remember. Each person who has access to the benefits of public property for use in his own personal business has a positive incentive to drain the resources from the commons. But he has a very low or even negative incentive to restrain himself. So here's the long and short of it. If you have access to other people's property and it's your right and you're taking it out of the commons, you have a positive incentive to consume. You have a negative incentive to pay. Everybody understands that's human nature 101. Every man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. And members of the commons have no true way even to determine the costs. Worse, they have the legal means to cost shift to their neighbors. So, they do. They have a positive incentive to consume, but a negative incentive to contribute. That's why common ownership of food, raising, healthcare, education, or anything else you can imagine will eventually collapse of its own internal contradictions, sooner or later. Makes no difference either what the culture is. This is about human nature 101 and economics 101. The New England Puritans were righteous, they were godly, they were disciplined, they were hardworking and virtuous by most standards. But they couldn't make this common living in common work. They couldn't make communism work. Puritans couldn't make it work either. Russians couldn't make it work. Neither could the Chinese or the United. Neither can Americans, and neither could nor can modern Jews. Let me tell you a quick story. 1987, after one of Israel's Lebanon wars, I had a chance to visit Israel, and the Israelis showed a handful of us, and I was a journalist covering this back then. Israelis showed a handful of us around the country, trying to demonstrate to the world that Israel was now, again, safe enough to have tourism come back. People get scared to go to Israel when there's a war on, for good reason. They want to get caught in a crossfire. So the war was over, hey, it's all safe to come back again. We were taken to a moshav. That's a cooperative farm. It was just north of Jerusalem, in sight, on side of a hill next to the Galilee, which is the lake out there, which is euphemistically called the sea, now is the lake. And on this beautiful hillside overlooking the Galilee, this gorgeous farm, absolutely magnificent place. There was crops there, there's dairy cattle, several houses with settlers, committed to sharing the work and mission of a labor cooperative. Sometimes the kibbutz system was even more communal. The moshav, a little less formal, but it was still common ownership by investors who were all Jewish who wanted to live that way. This is similar in sort of an effect of maybe the Amish a little bit, but a little more economically formal. Well, our van driver gave us a quick and very well-practiced tour of the place and handed us off to another member of the cooperative to give us even a more detailed tour. Now, we waved goodbye to the driver and introduced ourselves to the tour guide. Well, when I get into new relationships and meet new people, interviewing guests perhaps, or in a new social situation, I'm kind of a bull in the china closet on purpose. It's the fastest way to get to know people is to harass them a little bit. And you'll find out instantly if they have a sense of humor, how they think, or if they're defensive, if they are outgoing, if they're an A-type personality, or if they're an introvert. You find out within seconds what you're dealing with. So I kind of enter the room mouth first. This will not come as a shock to any of you. So sometimes I pay a big price for that. Sometimes I develop really close, quick relationships. It just takes down a lot of barriers quickly. So anyway, I did this on this occasion. So I introduced myself to the guide, and I thanked him for taking the time to show us around. And I added, with no truth to this whatsoever, I said, you know, that driver, he told us that he did all the work around here, and that he has to do the work of 3 people just to keep this place going. Is that true? Now, I expected that response. I expected a laugh with something like, he's full of shinola. I'm the one that does all the work around here. But instead, this Israeli turned 17 shades of purple, and he said, what? That lion buzzard, or words to that effect. Then he launched into a bunch of Hebrew words that I'm sure never made it into the King James Bible. And it took me about 10 minutes to calm him down by telling him, no, I just made it up, honest. He didn't really say any of that. He never quite believed me. But it came really obvious to me that all was not all that cooperative on that cooperative. That human nature was pretty thin, even in a group of people who had volunteered for socialism. They were having trouble making it work on the hillside overlooking the Galilee within missile range of the Syrians and the people who lived in Lebanon. This is another illustration of the tragedy of the commons. Even contemporary socialist Jews who volunteered to go start a new country and have a Jewish state could not make socialism work. They were highly motivated to. So what's my point? We keep forgetting these lessons, and we keep getting sold into socialism by the political class. Even though nobody healthy wants to be in one of those situations, and though it's even, as has been previously pointed out, it's illegal under our form of government. So bigger than Social Security, bigger than Medicare and Obamacare, whatever welfare state program you and I could name, the biggest egregious example of the tragedy of the commons is our current public education system. Government, Our government education system is, conceptually, even if we were as well-intended, even if the best people were running it, the most cooperative people who were on the same page were running it, it wouldn't work. It can't work. Human nature wouldn't prevent it, and it would prevent it. Now, I appreciate what Mr. Goranson and Stauffer said about how we deal with this situation, what the transitions need to be. But when our country first began, they and everybody at that generation insisted upon a commitment to educate the next generation. And when the new states were added to the original 13, by this time the progressive movement was in so much power that they insisted that new states, when they were added, like Iowa in the mid-1800s, had to make a commitment to free public education because they made it a prerequisite for admission to the Union. All the new states had to make a similar, because by that time, progressive education was so centralized, so much in control, they could even make that as a prerequisite. Everybody had stopped, everybody's still fighting over slavery, but the idea that government education, public education was a common, should still remain in the commons, that was just normal because the progressive had taken over. Back then, public education was fee-based. It was paid for by parents, and apt children of the poor were given schooling paid by civic groups and donations. The education extortion racket hadn't been invented by then. Even then, though, the buddings of conflict were apparent. The Pilgrims and the Puritans wanted to educate the next generation, the kids. They wanted their kids educated so that they could read the Bible, know God, and build a city on a hill. They understood what the purpose of education was. The progressives wanted to latch onto the schools in order to eradicate the influence of those Christians, the Puritans and their religion. So the early progressives thought that education could repair human nature. In fact, they thought if kids could be kept away from their religious parents for most of the time, as much as possible, the children wouldn't be tainted by those religious notions of evil being part of human nature, but merely being environmental. In fact, the father of public education, Horace Mann, said the common school, remember the tragedy of the commons, he even called it the common school, is the greatest discovery ever made by man. Other social organizations are curative and remedial, but this, that is, the common school, is a preventative and an antidote. They come to heal diseased wounds. We build the moral and physical frame to make people invulnerable to them. Let the common school be expanded to its capabilities, that is, send us more money. And 9/10 of the crimes that are listed in the penal code would become obsolete. The long catalog of human ills would be abridged. Men would walk more safely by day, and every pillow more inviolable by night. And for progressives, education equals a cure-all for sin. They would never use the word sin. They would say bad choices and crime. Teach him, that is the common student, teach the common student the facts about his body, and youth will be less tempted by gin and swearing and tobacco. We could add in a modern list, and dope, and teen sex, and STDs, and abortion, and low self-esteem. How's that theory working? Well, obviously we haven't given them enough money yet. Well, for the ancient Jews, and for the Pilgrims, and the Puritans, the goal of education was to inform the next generation of what is right and what is wrong, and to make them accountable to the law and to parents and to God, and to just make them aware of what is expected of them and make them accountable to it. For progressives, education exists to unlock this generation's, the next generation's virtue. By the way, if your first instinct upon hearing some story involving human frailty is to think, well, you know, that person just needs more education, you are a progressive, and you are part of the problem. So what's my conclusion? instead of fixing or repairing or reforming No Child Left Behind or Common Core or Agenda 21 or whatever nonsense the centralizing government educrats serve up tomorrow, instead of reforming it, public education should be defunded and dismantled. Now, I know, now I appreciate what Mr. Goranson and so forth were saying. I'm not just beating up on government education here, and I know what everything I just said is totally impractical and not doable now. But the approach that Mr. Goranson was taking earlier is a really great first step. Defund it and kill it. Bury it and replace it is what we should be doing. By the way, just if people are allowed the freedom to do what Mr. Goranson was saying, people will vote for it with their feet. And we won't have to do anything with the government education system over a long period of time because people will abandon it like rats leaving the sinking Titanic. And it might slow down in the process. And then government education might say, hey, if we don't straighten up, we won't be able to compete. And we might have to go get a real job. And then we'll panic and fix it. Maybe. The great irony here is that when we had waves of Catholic immigrants coming into the country, the Protestant common schools joined with the progressives at that time to make public school, common schools, compulsory. They wanted the public schools to act as cultural missionaries to turn those new little Catholic kid immigrants into good little Protestant kids. And the Catholics were just too smart to fall for that, so they began the parochial school movement to protect their children. And by the way, they have unjustly been paying twice to educate their own kids for generation after generation. Then the progressives took complete control and tried to use the public schools to turn the little Protestant kids into progressive little pagans. Sadly, that's worked pretty well. So, it was the ancient Puritans who tried to use the commons to maintain their hold on the community because not embracing the dissidents who didn't want to become Puritated just like the rest of them. Now it's the progressive educrats who hate the homeschool movement that want a progressive monopoly for the very same reason. Progressive pretending to care about homeschool kids by saying stuff like, well, we worry that homeschool kids won't be properly socialized. Trust me, that's exactly the result which homeschool parents were hoping for in the first place, because they were never properly socialized either, and they want to pass on that gift to the next generation. One last quick story. There was once a plumber who lived in the east side of Des Moines, lived in a modest house, in a very modest little working class neighborhood. But his fondest wish was to live in the suburbs. He just couldn't stand living where he did. He didn't want to live where he lived. His image of utopia was in some suburbs. I mean, he wanted a house with a 2-car garage. He wanted walk-in closets. He wanted a full-size yard. He wanted good schools for his kids. In short, he wanted to live large in the burbs and grow a crop of yuppie larvae. That's what he wanted to do. So he scrimped and he saved for years. Finally, enough so he could put 20% down on a 2-story, 3-bedroom, 2-car garage house in Johnston. For those folks not here from Iowa, Johnston is just a little suburb, just out north of town. So he bought a house and he started to begin his fantasy life. He rented a U-Haul truck. He loaded it himself with the help of a rented dolly and a couple of buddies and his wife, and he moved into Johnston. And he was so happy. And at last his dream was coming true, and finally he backed his U-Haul up into his new driveway, dropped the loading ramp down from the back of the truck onto the cement, and started to unload his truck. It was only then that this thought struck him. Hey, I don't have a lawnmower. I don't have a corner lot. I have lots of lawn. I don't have a lawnmower. What am I going to do? I've spent all of my money on that 20% down and buying this house and moving my stuff in. I can't afford a lawnmower. What am I? They thought and almost despaired, and then it hit him. Wait a minute. Hey, this is Johnston. This is the middle class. I've arrived. What I'm going to do, all these people who live here are wealthy. So what I'm just going to borrow a lawnmower from one of my neighbors until I've saved up enough money to buy one for my own. Problem solved. One of the neighbors, watching him move in from between the curtains in his picture window, is looking at the new guy and thinking to himself, says, gee, I hope the new guy's got a lawnmower. That's the true nature of all this. And she was talking about, and Mrs. Bowen was talking about what are we going to do? How do we deal with the pro-life issue? How do we stop this? How do we sever that relationship? The biggest impulse I think we can do to deal with the life issue, get rid of Social Security. Do you have to terminate the welfare state? Because the people looking down the street who are just about ready to join Social Security, and they have aborted their kids, they're going to look around and say, hey, I sure hope the new guys have some kids that can contribute to my Social Security fund. Sure hope the new people have kids, because I don't have any. There is something, what's worse? What's the worst thing about the tragedy of the commons? It's being a commoner. Being somebody who is in the public suit, dependent upon that herd mentality, dependent upon the political process that enables it in the first place. The worst thing about the tragedy of the commons is being in the commons. Don't be a commoner, therefore. Strive to become a self-governing freeholder. Avoid not only foreign entanglements, but domestic ones as well. Be a free, sovereign, godly, as much as you can avoid any entanglements with any level of government, and be as free from its constraints and restraints, means you're a law-abiding, free-holding citizen who is a God-fearing individual. So I describe myself, you guys are describing yourself, this was a conference for Christian conservatives. I'm using another term to describe myself. I consider myself a Christian libertarian. Now what's the difference? Well, a pagan libertarian says to himself and to God an attitude like this: you ain't the boss of me. That's a pagan libertarian, secular libertarian. Christian libertarian is, because God is the boss of me, I will never endanger your life, liberty, and property. That's a Christian libertarian who is a free-holding, God-fearing friend and neighbor. So anyway, as I close here, I was just thinking, given my never be a commoner notion, I want you to remember, how can I get you to remember that? And I was thinking about that, and hey, if I could I'll call up Willie Nelson, the country music singer, and I'll ask him to rewrite one of his songs. Mama, don't let your babies grow up to be commoners. I think that's kind of cool. Just sing it. Sing it a couple times, then you'll remember. Mamas, don't let your baby... Now, you can do better. I know you guys are a bunch of uptight, crazy, homeschooling, little right-wing whack jobs. But you can sing a Willie Nelson song. I know you're not too uptight to do that. Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be commoners. Okay, it's one last time. Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be commoners. You guys are just a disappointment. You know that. All right, you're going to be thinking about that no matter what. And you'll be thinking about that through lunch. You're going to be humming that anytime that comes on the program. And you're going to hear Willie Nelson. It's going to destroy you for life. You'll never be able to hear that song again without me in your mind. Now, I have an antidote for that. Now, I'm going to share this with you only with your permission. Because the antidote sometimes has been known to kill off the it's been worse than the disease. You ready? All right. Now that'll kill off the Willie Nelson thing. And now you're going to be thinking phenomena, all that rest. Anyway, my work is done. Thank you for listening.